So in this video production phase of my life, I have thought this question: why do you do it? And you might have the same question: why are you doing this? And I guess if I answered it the way I really feel, it would be that I'm doing it because I'm under the perhaps misguided belief that somebody might watch it and I might help them, and by doing so, I will have accomplished something meaningful. And I don't know if anybody's going to watch these or not. I sometimes, as I'm doing these, I think, are you just kidding yourself, or do you honestly think somebody's going to watch this someday? More than maybe 5 minutes or less at the beginning and just shut it off, because we live in a society that kind of wants things fast and they want it now, and they got other things to do and other places to go. So maybe I'm off in la la land thinking that I'm actually going to create something that's going to be meaningful to somebody. But that's kind of a negative way of thinking about it, and I don't like to think negatively. I like to think optimistically. I like to have hope. And I'm finding it's one of the challenges that I have is trying to keep my mindset on being hopeful and optimistic and actually believing that what I try to do can be done. And I'm kind of grateful that I've gone through life with that attitude, because there's been a few things that I've started and then stopped. But for the most part, I've kind of forged ahead and have been content to take little steps and see them grow. And when they do, when you take little steps, I guess just like a little baby, when they take little steps, they can see it actually gets them somewhere. Then pretty soon they take bigger steps, and next thing you know, they're trotting across the floor and can even run, sometimes faster than me now. But it's all a process. Well, tonight I'm going to kind of break from pattern a little bit. I'm going to tell you, so you've heard of the old phrase, oh, that's a fish story, meaning you're telling you're telling a big one there. It didn't really happen quite like that. And you say, oh, that's a fish story, because when people tell fish stories, the fish might be that big, but when you tell the story, it gets that big. And then the story gets more interesting. Isn't that the way it goes? Well, you'll have to decide whether I'm being entirely truthful with you, but I'm going to tell you some things that all relate to fish. And I guess part of the reason I'm doing this is because I might as well just get the fish stuff out of the way. And it's something I want to say. And there's some things I learned from my experiences with fish and fishing. And who knows? Maybe I make a believer out of you if you're gullible. Maybe I can grow the fish from this big to this big. Then you will really think I'm something, which I'm here to tell you I'm really not much out of the ordinary for the most part. I think there are some things about me that are a little out of the ordinary. Maybe not necessarily in a good way, but you've maybe already noticed. I like to think about things and try to analyze maybe way too much. All right, fish stories. Fish story number 1. My brother and I milked cows for my dad, and he had 2 farms to run for a lot of the time we were youngsters. One of them was where on the farm where we were born. It was 112 acres, and we had a milk barn there. And for the most part, that's where we ran our farm and milked our cows and did all that. But my dad had previously worked for a man by the name of Lyman Hymas, and he was an older gentleman. I've met him and I got to know him, but I was just a kid, and I don't remember much about how his personality was or whatever. I just knew that he and my dad had a good friendship, and Dad had worked for him before. Well, it so happens that when we were growing up, this gentleman farmer, who had, I don't know, maybe 80, 90 acres, counting some range ground and whatever, and he milked cows himself and had a pretty nice barn for back in the day. It's caved in and gone now, as most of those old barns are. But he talked my dad into coming back to work for him, and this time he wanted him to, rather than just help him work, he wanted him to just do the work, take it over and lease the ground. And anyway, he did that, and partway through the process, he passed away, and his sons actually were the owners of the land. But my dad kept running it, and we were involved in haying and taking care of things. There was a spring on the property, I remember, that was kind of unique. It ran quite a bit of water, and it's kind of unique to have a spring. It didn't run the water very far because it wasn't very far away from the creek. But we'd catch it in a pond, and it would run down into the creek, and there was some fish down there. I told you I'm going to tell you fish stories. Anyway, we'd catch some fish there, but those aren't the ones I was going to tell you about. The one that I retained. It's interesting how we remember things from years and years back. What things actually impress themselves on our minds enough that we remember them. Where a lot of things we just forget. Let me divert here for just a little bit. Part of the reason that makes me say that is because I taught for 33 years in the school system up in Rich County, and quite often since those days, now I've been retired for 20 plus years from that job after 33 years of teaching. And during that time, I taught different grade levels and even different subjects. And occasionally nowadays I'll run across some students here or there at some event or in a store maybe, or wherever. They just show up, and there they are, a student from days gone by. And it's a little embarrassing for me because sometimes I recognize the face, but I get the names messed up. Maybe it's because of old age, but maybe it's just because there's too many kids to remember them all. And I prefer to think the latter. I don't like to think of myself as really, really old, So anyway, they'll come up to me, and I really like it when they do. They'll call me by name, and they usually put a Mr. They'll say Mr. Eborn, and thank you, and this, that, and the other. And I've always appreciated them for that. I have it happen almost every couple of weeks, at least. Somebody somewhere. Well, the reason I say that as far as remembering goes is because quite often they'll start into this story. Do you remember when? And they'll tell me a story. And they'll say, do you remember what you did and you said, and then you did this and you did that, and I just have to look at them when they're done and say, I'm sorry, I'm not saying it didn't happen, but I don't remember any of that. And yet it made quite an impression on them, or they wouldn't have remembered it all these years. So I guess the point I'm making is that we tend to be selective in what we remember. And I don't think it's just with old people. I think it's with young people too. They carry certain memories with them and others they discard. Well, back to my fish story. I'm kind of wandering here tonight. But there was a fish in the spring of the year that there was a flush of water that come out of the hills when it got so warm. And I remember they always used to say, when that flush of water, because you'd wake up one night, it wouldn't be much water at all. And the next morning you wake up, it was usually after a warm spell, and the meadows would just be flooded, and the ditch banks would be run over, and there would be all kinds of water. And it wouldn't last too long. And they always said, the old timers would always say, that's the Copenhagen Lakes have come out. And what they meant by that, I found out, was way up in the mountains, there was a big basin up in there, and it accumulated a lot of water. And there was usually ice and snow dams that held it in the basin until it backed up and got deep enough, like I said, usually after a warm spell, that the ice or the water would eventually break through and start a stream downstairs or down in the hill, and then once it started, it just opened wide up, and the whole basin emptied almost overnight. Well, we called that the Copenhagen Lakes coming out, and it flooded us down where our cows were, where we milked our cows down on this farm that I was talking about. And I remember after those days, I always liked to fish, and I usually always fished with a wooden pole, something I've taken off a willow bank, just tied a line on, bought a hook and some leader and put on there and go fishing that way. And I can remember going down after one of those, and there was this spot in the field where there's just because the water had subsided considerably, but there was this one spot in the field, and I don't know what made the hole to begin with, whether it was a beaver or something, but there was this hole about, maybe 4 foot diameter or something like that. And I'd fished and hadn't had much luck. I was coming back to the barn, wanted to take a trout home, and at least show my parents that I could catch a fish. Anyway, I dipped my hook, and we always put a little worm on the hook, because that was our bait. We didn't go much for the lures or anything. We just put a worm on the hook, and I dropped it down in that hole, and lo and behold, I got this bam, bam, bam. There was a fish in there, and as soon as he saw that worm, he hit it like nobody's business, and he just really, it just shocked me, because I was mostly just fooling around. I didn't even think there was a chance there'd be a fish in there. And I put it in there and caught a great, great big old brook trout. It was as big a brook trout as I've ever caught. And so that's one fish story. It's not that big a deal, I realize that. There was another place that wouldn't have been more than 75 yards from there. It was more in the I would say in the mainstream, but as the summer went by, that mainstream that I'm talking about here wasn't really the mainstream. It was just kind of a feeder to the mainstream, the Obed Creek, and it was called Mill Creek, if I remember right. It was called Mill Creek, and it was just a little stream that came down below the barn. The cows would water in it, and occasionally there'd be a fish in it, but not really what you'd call a fishing stream. However, if you went upstream a little ways, there was a spot up there where the water was a little deeper, and it went under these Well, there's kind of a willow bank that stuck out on one side of the stream. And holy cow, in the fall of the year, when you've been fishing all summer and hadn't had that much luck, and you looked under there, and there would be some monster trout. I mean, they were just huge. And very few small ones, but just great big trout. And they just kind of browsed around under there, and if you got too close, they'd work their way back up under the bank where you couldn't see them much. But if you was able to get up a little closer, catch them by surprise a little bit, there they were, just big trout, maybe 8 or 10 at least, of just really big, nice trout. And they were, I used to love to eat trout. They were good. My mom could really cook them up well in a frying pan, and I enjoyed them. Well, those trout basically taunted my brother and I all summer one year, because we tried everything we could have to catch them, and we couldn't. Nothing seemed to work. Sometimes if you wanted to fudge just a little bit, you'd leave your pole set all night long while you were doing, maybe if we had a little camp up there sometimes that we stayed in, a little tent with some a bed in it, and we'd stay up there, so we'd be there early to milk the cows in the morning. So sometimes we'd leave the pole out all night, thinking, boy, they'll come out at night and they'll see that worm and they'll latch onto it and we'll have big trout. Well, it didn't turn out that way, because they were just too smart. The reason they were big was because they were smart. I figured that out after a while. Isn't that the way it goes? The big ones just won't let you. Same with mule deer. Those big ones get so smart that they can outfool you almost every time and just lay down in the brush, and you can't kick them out no matter how hard you're hunting. Well, it's the way it was with these fish. They just taunt you onto there, and went on like that all summer till we couldn't take it anymore. And we laid a plan. And the plan was, we had an old Minneapolis Moline tractor. It was an odd looking thing, and it was, I can remember my dad only paid, I think, $400 for it. And anyway, turned out that we had a pump that we could hook up to the power takeoff on that tractor. And we got this idea, hey, let's go down there and kind of pile some rocks at the head of that little trickle of water that's feeding those fish, that stream there. And if we pile some rocks there, and then we get right after it, we can throw water out of there with this pump faster than it's coming in, which means that eventually that fishing hole that those big trout are in are going to go swimming on bare rocks, because we'll have all the water pumped out of the hole. That was our plan. Okay, so it's turned into a real fishing story, isn't it? Well, anyway, so we got the tractor and we got the pump. We didn't know much about the law concerning those kind of things. I figured something might be wrong if somebody caught us, but we didn't really give it much thought. And so we backed the tractor down, turned it around, and we said, well, we found a spot where we thought we could pull it across the stream a little bit, close enough to the stream that we could get throw the suction tube in on the pump and get it primed and start the tractor up and the power takeoff and start the water throwing out of there. And we got it in there, piled our rocks up on the other side so that the water would be dammed off a little bit. We wouldn't have so much to pump for a little while. And just as we were getting it over there and ready to throw it in, we needed to pull it just a little bit further. And that's the way it always goes. Just a little bit more is all you have to do, and trouble broke out. Yeah, you guessed it. Because the hind wheel of that tractor slid off the bank and into a mud bog, and the tractor got stuck. And of course, I had the pump hooked on it, so we couldn't get the pump in the water, and the tractor was stuck. And if anybody found out about it, we knew we were in a pickle. Well, it turns out that we decided we'd better go get help because we didn't have any way to pull ourselves out. And there was a neighbor just down the road that we thought if we told him about it, maybe he could be quiet, not tell anybody, and come and help us. And he was a pretty good old boy. And sure enough, he heard our story and I guess felt sorry for us. And he came up and we hooked a chain on the tractor. We didn't really tell him exactly what we had in mind, but I'm pretty sure he could put it together when he saw what we were doing. I don't think he ever did see the fish, however, so who knows, but I'm sure he put it together. He wouldn't have been that dumb. And we pulled the tractor out and we took it up and parked it, and that adventure was over. So that's a fish story, another fish story. And we never did catch those fish. For all I know, they died of old age and had little ones, and they got just as big or bigger. And anyway, that was a safe haven for them back under those willows. And all we could do is be taunted by them because it wasn't 15 yards away from where our tent was down on the river for one whole summer, when we were staying up there milking cows all summer long. So along with milking cows, we tried to have a little fun, and we had a fish story to tell out of it. Now, the other fish, I got two more fish stories. My time's going to run out here because I don't want to go very long. But I'm going to tell you two more, and I'll tell you which one's my very best fish story. This next fish story was one that was with my older brother. He's about 10 years older than me. And I really looked up to him because there was, down at our main farm, the Ovid Creek from there was like a mile hike through the fields and down over the meadows, and finally you'd get to the creek, and that's where the fish were, of course. But in the process of hiking over there was at least in one spot, there was a place where it was a little too boggy and wet for a little guy like me that wasn't that big. I was maybe only 7 or 8 years old. And my brother would take me fishing, and when we'd get to that boggy part, he'd have me jump up on his back. I had to be careful with my fishing pole and hooks. I didn't hook him, but he was kind enough to let me jump up on his back and put my arms around his neck, and he'd carry me through that spot, and let me down on the other side, and away we'd go off to fish. Well, it wasn't in that exact same spot, but it was with him. And we went fishing one day, and sometimes we'd get tired of waiting for the fish to bite, just prop our poles up on a log or maybe a piece of willow forked willow that we'd stick in the ground and put a rock on the end of it or something, and we'd just wait. And if we wanted to go look at other parts of the stream or see what other things were going on up and down the stream, that's what we do. Well, we did that, and I put my pole there, and I forget what he did with his. I think he actually ended up taking it with him on this kind of little jaunt that we went on up the stream. But when we got back, something had bit the bait on the end of the line on my fishing pole, and it had pulled the pole so hard that it went clear down off the embankment and across the river and into the willows, clear over on the other side. We could see it. Now, the water's about, I'll say 4 feet deep or something like that, 4.5. And at least right there where we were fishing it was. And we looked at that fishing pole over there, and so you can just imagine what we were thinking. We were thinking, boy, how are we going to get that? There's probably a fish on there that's like no other fish you've ever seen in your life, that would pull a fishing pole clear down off the bank and clear across the stream and over into those willows. It would have been had to have been a monster. And we looked at that fishing pole and we looked at it. We could never figure out how we were going to get over there because the water was deep and it was muddy underneath, and the willows were kind of hanging down where the pole ended up, and couldn't get into it from the other side. So it was a predicament. And he kind of posed the question to me. He says, "Okay, what do you want me to do?" Well, keep in mind, he's 10 years older than me. He says, "What do you want me to do?" I says, "I think there's a big fish on there. Maybe you ought to wade across and find out what's on the end of that line, because it's got to be a monster fish, and we would hate to not get it if it's already hooked and ready to go." Anyway, that was kind of the explanation. And he kind of looked at me like, "You want me?" Kind of like, "Oh, you want me to go get it, huh? Why don't you go get it?" And so I was thinking, maybe I could. And I remember I got down there and I started looking into that water, and it was way deeper than I wanted to take on. And then besides that, it was kind of running. The water, there's a little bit of flow to the water, and I thought, I can't do this. So I went back up on the bank and I said, "Won't you do it? Won't you go in and get it? I know it's my pole, but won't you go in? And that's got to be a huge fish. Just think what we'll be able to tell everybody about that fish." Well, I can remember I talked him into it, and he said, but he made a deal with me. Brothers. Anyway, he made a deal with me. He said, "Okay, I'll go across and get that pole. But if that pole doesn't have a trout on it, if all it has on the end of it is a trash fish, like a chub or a sucker or a carp," which there were those in the stream too. He says, "if it's one of those, then you are in trouble, bad trouble. And I'm going to come across here and take care of you." And he kind of put the fear in me. But I wanted to see that big trout that was on that pole. So I kept telling him, I said, you got to go get it. He says, "All right, but if I do and it's a trash fish, you're going to get it. And I mean, in the very worst way, you're going to get it if I have to do all that and it's just a trash fish." Anyway, I think part of it was teasing, but I took it pretty seriously. And he took off his shoes and socks and rolled up his pants. He didn't take his pants off, and I knew they were going to get wet anyway. So he rolled them up, and down off the embankment he went and across that stream and hit him up a little past the waist, out in the middle and up on the other side under the embankment. And he finally found the line and got it untangled, and yeah, there was something on the end of it. And he found it. And I was pretty interested in seeing what it was, because it needed to be a trout really bad, or I was in trouble. And he pulled it up and he says, "It's a sucker." And he says, "And you are gonna get it." And he came marching across that stream with that sucker on the end of that line, and he was mad. I don't think he was all that mad, but he put on a show that scared me. And you know what I did? I just turned around and ran for home as fast as I could go. Now, a whole mile, thinking that, oh, I'm going to be in so much trouble. And if he ever catches me, I'm toast. So I just ran all the way home, and he never did catch me, and I never did have to pay any consequences for making him do that, just for a sucker. All right, that's fishing story number 3. Fishing story number 4 is when I'm trying to think of the age. It's hard for me capture the ages sometimes, but I think on this one I was maybe 12 or something, somewhere thereabouts. And by then my older brother had gone off to school, and he wasn't around anymore. Anyway, come to think of it, he may have gone on a mission by then. And I had a couple of sisters, which it's all fine. Sisters are all fine and good, but they don't like to fish much. I could never find a fishing desire in them at all. And so it was one of those days when there was kind of a lag between crops and the cows were milked that morning. And I was kind of, my mother would never, or either one of my mother or dad would never put up much for saying we were bored, because if you said we were bored, they'd find you something to do real quick. There's always a fence to fix or something like that. So I was real hesitant to say much, but I kind of indicated over and over again, I wish there was somebody I could go fishing with, because I'd been a time or two before and I hadn't had much luck. And I thought maybe if I had somebody that could show me where the holes were better, or give me some luck anyway, I'd catch a fish. Well, it turns out that my mother finally felt sorry for me. And so we got in an old Ford truck, and it was quite the truck. And we went down the road about 3/4 of a mile, and then we turned on through a gate and into a dirt road. And it took us down this same area of the creek that I've told you about before, but we called it the old swimming hole, because back in the day, the kids, I guess, liked to go swimming in that area of the creek, and there was a kind of a pond-like feature in the creek. I mean, the water still flowed through it, but it was a bigger area, and they'd stuck a plank, a 2-inch, maybe even a 3-inch plank back into the embankment, and you could still see a kind of a rotted edge sticking out where they would run and jump into the water off that plank. So we called it the old fishing hole, though it used to be the swimming hole, so sometimes it'd be the old swimming hole. Anyway, we knew what it was when we'd say, I'm going to the old swimming hole to fish. Well, we knew where it was. And that's where we decided to go that day. And we drove part way, and then my mother had, she was in a dress. I don't know why, but a lot of times they wore dresses in the day, and not so much. My mother didn't wear pants so much. In fact, rarely. And she took me fishing down there. Well, I fished and fished and fished. Guess what? It was just, I don't know whether it was too hot or things weren't going right. I couldn't catch a fish. I got a few nibbles. And I think I even caught one little perch that was a short yellowish fish with a real sharp dorsal fin that if you weren't careful, it'd cut your hands. But they wasn't any good. And finally, I caught what we call a chub. Now, a chub is also considered a trash fish. And what that means is, if it's a trash fish, that means it's not good for anything but to feed the pigs or whatever. It's not for human consumption. And there were carp and suckers and chub and some perch and things like that we just referred to as trash fish. Well, as it turns out, I caught one chub. And if my memory serves me right, I did catch a littler chub. But then I just kept fishing, nothing happened. I think my mom could sense that I felt bad about the whole experience, and there she was trying to help. And so she said, you know something? I think that chub looks pretty darn good. Let's just take it home, see what we get. So we did. And I'll never forget, we went home, and before she did anything else, she went in and got a knife, and a chub has scales on it, and you have to get a knife, and you have to rub it back and forth and get all the scales off the fish. That's one of the reasons we didn't want to mess with them. And then the bones inside the fish were all over the place, and you couldn't really get them out. So they were hard to That's another reason we call them trash fish, is that the meat had bones in them and it didn't taste that great. But she kept talking up this chub and how nice it looked, and I couldn't see anything really special about that chub at all. But she was trying to cheer me up and thinking, boy, you really, all kinds of things. She said, you really caught a nice fish, and boy, we don't want one like that go to waste. And anyway, she went in and we had a little gas burner stove outside, and we lit it up, and we got a frying pan, and we cleaned the fish out and scaled it and cut off its head and fins and got it ready to fry, and we fried that fish, that trash fish, the only one that I could catch, mind you, the only one. And we fried that catfish, and when it was done, why, she and I sat down, and she got a plate and a fork and some sort of drink. Usually it's milk, I think. But we sat down and we ate trash fish. all the while she was eating it, she was saying, "Oh my, doesn't that taste so good? Oh, am I glad you caught that fish?" She just kept really trying to boost my ego. Well, you can probably guess which one's my favorite fish story. It's that last one. And the reason it's my favorite fish story is because I've thought back on it lots of times. And I've thought back and I thought, my mother didn't have to go fishing with me that day. She could have waited until my brother could go, or anyway, she didn't have to go, and she sacrificed. I don't know what she had going on at the house, but I'm sure she sacrificed some things to take me fishing a good part of the afternoon. And I've thought to myself, and she felt so bad for me because I couldn't catch fish. And then when I did catch a fish, it's the only one I could catch was a trash fish. And so she made up her mind that she was going to turn that trash fish into a real prize with pure talk, and she did. She did. And something, that trash fish didn't taste all that bad. Part of it was because she put lots of butter on it, I think. But I've thought back to that story a lot of times, and the takeaway that I have from that one, the reason it's my favorite, is because she loved me. And even today, when I think about it, I have to swallow a little bit deeper. Maybe a tear will come to my eye or something, because she's been gone for a long time. And I'll think, that's kind of what she did her whole life, was turn trash fish into something better than what they really were. And I never felt like I went without anything, even a good tasting fish, when I could only catch trash fish. And I just admire her so much when I think about that fishing story. And I ask myself, am I that same kind of person? Can I take somebody's bad day and do everything I can to turn it into a good day? Can I take some negatives and draw some lines through and make them positives? Maybe steer somebody away from being gloomy and put a smile on their face. That's what she did that day. And I've never forgotten it. So those are my 4 fish stories. And I'm not sure which one you liked the best, but I'm guessing if you really took in what I had to say, you liked the same one that I did. And may we all be like her in those kinds of circumstances. I love her, and I love you. Good night. Happy fishing.